Hello, and welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast from Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm your host, Rebecca Christie. Welcome to this very special episode all about Ireland and its economy and its relationship with Europe and the rest of the world. We have amazing guests today. We have Patrick Honohan, former governor of the Irish Central Bank, and Eamon Gilmore, former foreign minister, and many other senior jobs. They are here now to speak to us about how it all works and how it fits together. Patrick, can you set the stage for people who haven't been following along? A lot of our listeners are in the U.S. Ireland has changed so much. You wrote a great book about it, about how some of the investments in the society led to this rise of a tech economy, of a economy with lots of skills. But then, of course, there was a banking crisis and a sovereign debt crisis, and now we're on the other end of it and things are coming back. Where are we?
Yes, it's if you blinked and went to sleep sometime around 2010, you might have thought, well, that's it. We won't be hearing about Ireland for a long time because they're in the soup. After the global financial crisis, Ireland was one of these spectacular failing economies. And now look at Ireland today, and you get if you just look at the headline numbers, you get a very, very rosy picture. Some of it true, some of it a little bit exaggerated by the statistics, but it's certainly true that with Europe more generally in a sort of flat, stagnant period for the last couple of years, Ireland's economy is moving ahead, has been moving ahead quite smartly. So a lot of people are a bit puzzled at how Ireland could have come from a bad situation 15 years ago to a relatively strong position now. Now, that's not to say that there aren't many problems that Ireland needs to deal with, but it's certainly a big turnaround. I suppose there are two or three key reasons why Ireland managed to recover from the crisis better than the other badly affected economies in Europe, such as Greece and Italy and Portugal. One of the reasons is that indebtedness was a huge problem for Ireland, both in the government's indebtedness and the financial sector's indebtedness. The period of low interest rates, which went right through the second part of the 2010s, right until a couple of years ago, that was a great help to managing down our debt problems because the interest rates at which the government had to pay were a lot less than they would otherwise have to have been. And financial assistance from European funds was a big part of that. But of course, it was just a wider low interest rate environment, which meant that over-indebtedness was not as serious a problem as it would have been if interest rates had been more normal. The second dimension is, and it's kind of vital to mention, the Irish, Eamon will speak more, I'm sure, about politics, but the Irish political system managed to take steps of fiscal correction that would have been very difficult in a society that didn't understand the economics of the situation. Ireland had been through difficult times before, and it's quite a highly educated society. And they understood, they didn't like fiscal adjustment, but they understood that if fiscal adjustment wasn't going to take place, that the problems of the economy would become more and more severe. So the fiscal adjustment, which was very aggressive, managed to put Ireland back on a growth path. The third factor, and it's a really important factor for Ireland, is that for a longer period, for many decades, a really important part of the growth process in Ireland has been the arrival of multinational firms, mostly from the United States, bringing high-tech productive production activities to Ireland and modern technology and tax revenue. And those companies were not put off by the collapse of the global financial crisis. They didn't say, oh, Ireland is in trouble, let's move somewhere else. They were not affected by the financial crisis. They said, Ireland is still a good location. It's a predictable tax environment, still plenty of well-qualified workers. And in fact, the expansion of the multinational sector accelerated after the crisis. That is still an accelerating factor today, though with changes in US policy, we don't know whether this important US dimension of the Irish growth story in Europe is going to continue as successfully. So those are the three elements that I would pick out as causal of Ireland's recovery. It's a strong recovery. Employment growth in the economy has averaged 3.5% per annum over the past 10 years. And in fact, immigration has become a big characteristic of Ireland. In the last couple of years, immigration has averaged almost 1.5% of the population, and in the previous years, it was running, close to about, three quarters of a percent to, or a little more than that, for several years. So we have a lot of new workers here coming from all over the world. Well, a lot from Europe, but all sorts of different parts of the world, and it's a really vibrant society.
Thanks so much for that, Eamon. Give us a little bit of a political orientation here. We have a new government that just set up. You certainly have seen Ireland form many coalitions. You had your time as Deputy Prime Minister, coming from not one of the two big parties. How have these coalitions managed to stay together, and how has Ireland avoided the far right surge we've seen in other places?
Let me just pick up on one or two things that Patrick said. First of all, on the political issue and what was needed to address the financial crisis, 2010, 2011. The government of which I was Deputy Prime Minister, or Taoiseach, was elected at the beginning of 2011. And we had, I suppose, the rather unenviable task of leading the country out of that recession and back to growth again. And that meant taking some very difficult decisions. You often hear calls for politicians and governments to act courageously. We didn't have any choice but to act courageously. But we had to make a lot of very difficult decisions. And the Irish people in particular had to endure a lot of pain during that period of time to get the country back to where it is today. And I'm glad that we did that. Secondly, in relation to foreign direct investment, I think there was a pause on foreign direct investment at that time. There was a degree of nervousness, and certainly as a government, we were very conscious that part of our job was to restore the country's international reputation and to rebuild confidence among investors in the country. And that was the primary role that I had to perform as Minister for Foreign Affairs. I would say in relation to the political situation, the political landscape in Ireland has changed. The last election, the two largest parties, the centre-right parties, which had dominated Irish politics since our Civil War, between them, they've just over 40% of the vote. The largest of those used to get 40% on their own. If you put together all of the parties that describe themselves as left or left of centre, you now have about 35% among all of them. It's very fractured. You have a much more fractured political environment than you've had before. But we do have a government which has now been elected, which is stable, which looks like it will last the full duration. We've had coalition government has been a feature of Irish politics really since the late. We've had coalitions at different times, but I think since the late 80s, we haven't had a single. 1977, I think, was the last time that the country elected a single party government. So coalition has been the norm for really almost half a century now. I think the key to it is getting a degree of compatibility on policy, sitting down, and I participated in these negotiations at different times, sitting down and negotiating a programme for government, which is the policy programme of the government itself, but also the way in which the government is structured. And at the time of the economic crisis, we did a number of new things. We established, for example, what was called the Economic Management Council, which was basically the two people from each of the two parties in government, and brought in the senior officials in the civil service. And I know Patrick from time to time attended some of the meetings as a kind of it was almost like a kind of a war cabinet to address the economic crisis at that time. So that's how it works. Coalition is now norm. It's and we have a coalition of the two parties that were political opponents for most of the history of the country.
It's kind of remarkable. Do you think that Economic Council would be a model for other countries in Europe as they try to make some of the changes put forward by the Draghi report, the competitiveness compass, a lot of the things that are on the table right now?
I wouldn't offer it as a template, and indeed there was a lot of criticism of it. In Ireland when we had it. It was a feature of its time. I think the benefits of it were that where you had at that time two parties of different size in government, it provided a means for joint decision making. So all of the major budgetary decisions, and Patrick talked about the fiscal adjustments that had to be made, all of those major decisions were made at the Economic Management Council and were made on a joint basis by the two parties in government. So it provided for an equivalence where there wasn't an equality of numbers of members of Parliament. It was. It also, I think, provided a platform or a forum where the political leadership and the administrative leadership of the country in the civil service were able to sit down and hammer things out together. So it provided for, I think, a form of joined up government. It was, of course, always subservient to the government itself, to the cabinet, and recommendations from it always had to go to the cabinet for approval. But it was, I think, at that time, a very useful way of dealing with what was a crisis situation. And it met almost, it met every week routinely, but it met sometimes every day and sometimes a couple of times a day, depending on the issue that had to be dealt with.
Eamon, I wonder, do you think part of this, you mentioned the requirement to balance two parties in government, but do you think it's also just on a level of individual interactions, that a table with 6 or 7 people around it can have a real live discussion going into quite a lot of the necessary depth, when a table with 20 people around it can't? Everybody can make their point in a table with 20. There may be 1 or 2 very influential people, but it won't be a real discussion. Whereas if you have 6 or 7 people, you can have the real discussion and people can come out of the meeting with a different view than when they went into it. Do you think that had that kind of a dynamic with you? As you see, the four political leaders and then 2 or 3 key advisors or civil servants.
Well, yes, and that's why governments tend to operate a committee system. So if you have, a particular policy issue, there will inevitably be a cabinet subcommittee where you will have precisely that format, where you have a smaller number of people and issues are dealt with and options are looked at in greater detail, and also where you create a dynamic among the people who are making these decisions and an understanding among them. The Economic Management Council functioned in that way most of the time, but there were occasions when there were several occasions when there were political differences between the two parties. And what used to happen on those occasions was that the officials, the civil servants, would go and have a cup of tea and leave the 4 ministers, the Taoiseach, myself as Tánaiste, the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, and the Minister for Finance and the Minister for Public Expenditure. We were the 4 members of that grouping. So we would be left to ourselves, the 4 of us, to knock our heads and punch each other up politically until we had reached an agreement. So it also served, I think, to as a way in which, because sometimes in coalition governments, you get tensions, you get different political on issues, and particularly on that time, because the two parties, for example, went into the election. I think there was general agreement right across the political system at that time about the size of the adjustment that had to be made. The differences were about the length of time over which it was to be made and the ratio of tax measures and public expenditure measures that had to be done. And we came down to individual budgets and to particular measures. There was a lot of political disagreement on it. And this was a way of dealing with those political disagreements and arriving at compromises, some of which were very uncomfortable and very difficult, but nevertheless were taken because we had to deal with the crisis. It also, I think, provided a degree of cohesion between the two parties, because we set out the terms of the original bailout were very tight, and we had to create some space, and there was a degree of renegotiation that had to be done. The interest rate, for example, you'll recall that yourself, the period of time, measures like the minimum wage, some of the cuts in social welfare, issues on privatization of state assets. All of those we had to renegotiate. And you'll recall as well, and Patrick, the high drama we had over this, over the recapitalization of the banks, and in particular the money that had to go into the dead bank, which we stopped, and then we renegotiated a formula to deal with that. So all of those issues were discussed in detail by the Economic Management Council.
I think one of the characteristics of Ireland's response to the negotiations with the outside world, with the IMF and with the European Commission, European Central Bank, we really pulled together to an extraordinary extent. And I'm not just talking about politically, but when I hear stories about what other borrowing countries, the rows that would break out on one side of the table, instead of the country pulling together and providing a unified front, we seem to have been able to say we don't emphasize our internal differences. On the contrary, we work together to achieve what we want to achieve with the lenders. And I think that was a characteristic which we noticed ourselves. We did it deliberately, but the other side also noticed it. They couldn't find a chink in our armor.
No, we did do that. And I recall, as you mentioned, the IMF. I mean, I recall several meetings in Washington with the IMF, who I felt actually had a greater degree of understanding sometimes of particularly some of the political difficulties that we had than some of our European partners at that time. But the way we used to operate, for example, at European Council level, on the day of European Council meetings, the Taoiseach would obviously attend those on behalf of the government, but both he and I would travel together to Brussels. And we'd then go to our respective political groupings. Enda Kenny would go to the EPP meeting, and I'd go to the Socialist and Democrat, the S&D PES meeting. And we'd have, we knew what we were looking for at a council meeting, and what we need to do in terms of talking to people on the margins. We had that sorted and agreed beforehand. So we'd each go and talk with our colleagues at the. I talked, for example, to President Hollande at the PES meeting, and Enda Kenny talked to Chancellor Merkel at the EPP meeting. And we would then meet up after the two party meetings. We'd meet up in the Irish delegation at the council building, and we'd compare notes and so on. And so we did this. There was this joined up approach. We made sure that when we were talking externally, we were talking with one voice, and I think that was very important. And it was also very important. I remember one occasion when we were on the investment issue, on the FDI issue, and President Clinton, he was no longer president at that stage, but he had agreed to help us, and we had him at this Global Irish Forum that we had in Dublin Castle, and he agreed to convene a meeting of American business people who were had not already invested in Ireland. They didn't have operations in Ireland. And I remember at the meeting, because we had gone again with a joined up approach, and it was at a time when there was a lot of high drama in Washington about the budget and agreement on Capitol Hill and so on. And he pointed out, he said, these are the leaders of the two largest parties in Ireland. They're working in government together, and they have agreed a common, different political backgrounds, different approaches to issues, but they have agreed a common position, and you'll hear what it is. And I think it made a big impression. And, these were the kind of things. And that was reflected in the work that the diplomatic service was doing, that, the agencies, IDA and Enterprise Ireland and all of the agencies were doing. They were communicating this single message. But that was led by political agreement at the top. And that was difficult to achieve because we were in a really crisis situation, and the things we had to do were really, really difficult. But we understood, and we knew that we needed to be speaking with one voice. And I think the only thing that I if I can, I'm not involved in an Irish politics now, and I refrained from being a commentator on it. But it really does upset me that having gone through all of those challenges and difficulties and the sacrifices that people made, and that now we're a country with very significant surpluses and economically successful, that we seem to have been so slow in addressing the challenges of housing. I mean, I find it just incredible that with the money we now have, that we have 4 to 5 times the number of homeless people in the country than we had when we were in the middle of an economic crisis. It baffles me as to how we are not dealing with the challenges we now have, given that we have that there's money, and there's money because of the decisions that we made at that time and the steps we took to ensure that the economy recovered.
Patrick, how do you square this housing crisis with the good performance you were talking about earlier?
Of course, if I was a government spokesman, I would point to the difficulties housing is experiencing all over many countries, especially countries that have followed the sort of English common law practice, and with NIMBY behavior by people who don't want a big block of apartments, block of flats built in their neighborhood, and so on and so forth. But actually, I think there are other problems. Ireland is actually spending more than almost any other country, government spending on housing, but they're not spending it in the right way. They're spending it in, say, oh, well, the rents are very high. Let's provide a subsidy to people who want to rent. Let's provide some kind of assistance to people who want to buy houses. But all of these assistances are driving up the prices. So the only beneficiary are the owners of land and developers. So the money should be spent, I think, more directly in taking a government-led development, because the private sector is not delivering the goods. There are still a lot of legacy issues in financing of builders. The government needs to take a more proactive approach here. This, of course, is not something that our government system has geared up to. It for years and years. It used to do a lot of building for low-income people. It let that drop. Sold a lot of the public housing. Getting back into that is politically difficult for some people who don't want the government to be involved, but also not sure that we have the organizational capacity to do that well. I think that's the area where difficulties are arising here. Of course, there are surpluses. It's not just a question. It's not a question of money. The surpluses could be spent. Of course, there are various budgetary rules, but we're compliant with those. The argument is also made that, well, if the government starts to build houses, that's just going to drive up the cost of labor and materials. It'll overheat the economy. There are ways of compensating for overheating through the use of tax measures. So, yeah. It's true that this has not been thought through adequately. It's been thought about a lot, but nobody is prepared to change course. I think change of course is needed, but hasn't happened yet.
I think there are new things that can be done. I mean, we are in new times, and we're also in a situation where the population of the country is growing for a variety of reasons. One of the things I think that could be done is to square the housing shortage with the problem of dereliction. If you look at towns, cities, villages all over the country, there are derelict buildings everywhere. There is space over shops where, floors are storing cardboard boxes of various kinds instead of housing people. We could, there needs, I think, to be, you can deal with the housing crisis and also deal with the problem of dereliction and with the renewal of town centres and village centres, particularly now at times of remote working, where I think that would work. I think that's one approach.
Do you think Limerick is a model?
Yeah, indeed, yes. And Limerick has been a great... And Limerick didn't happen by accident. There was, I remember the task force that was chaired by the former chief executive of Kerry Company, Dennis Brosnan, and a strategy was developed for there. And there is now a directly elected mayor of the city, John Moran, former chief of the Department of Finance. I think also there are issues, I think, that need to be addressed, like, for example, the provision of housing for working people in the city. And there is a very big problem in Dublin, and employers will tell you the difficulty of retaining people in Dublin because of the difficulty in getting housing anywhere near where they work. So I think, again, there needs to be, I think, a strategy to ensure that there is provision of housing for key workers in the larger cities. So there are things that can be done, and money is not the problem now, I think, but it needs to be dealt with much more urgently than is the case, and I think in a much more innovative way than has been done up to now.
I think one of the things you mentioned here is the growth of population. When I look back, when I was a teenager, the lowest population of Ireland ever achieved was 2.8 million in the Republic. And now the population is almost twice that. And that's 60, 63, 64 years later. That is a dramatic increase. Of course, we've seen that sort of thing in the emerging markets. And we see their response is a type of city which we're not used to here. And I think we haven't squared that circle.
I'd like to talk about the role of Ireland in Europe and in the transatlantic dialogue, and how we can understand the role that Ireland plays and how we can see how that might affect a lot of the debates that are going on. Ireland is not a member of NATO, has typically been one of the more skeptical countries towards anything having to do with tax and joining up tax rates across Europe. Yet at the same time, Eamon, you certainly have been helpful in working on the peace process in all kinds of parts of the world, in Latin America, as well as helping the discussions in the neighborhood. We see that Ireland was a leader in getting the base erosion and profit shifting original agreement at the OECD. So there's kind of a push-pull here. What's going on now, and what do you think Ireland will contribute next?
I would question your description of Ireland's approach to some of the issues as skeptical. I wouldn't put it like that. I think Ireland has been, since our membership of the European Union, a very committed and very participative member in the European Union, and very strongly supportive of it. Like any member state, Ireland will have its own views on particular issues as they arise from time to time. On the taxation issue, for example, as you said, Ireland was one of the countries that encouraged the OECD to go the direction that it was going. On regulation, Ireland has been one of the better countries in the transposition of various regulatory measures and their implementation. There have been problems in some areas, but again, you will find that, I think, right across all member states. I think where we are at the moment, I think we're speaking in very uncertain times. You mentioned the transatlantic relationship. The transatlantic relationship for Europe is under severe strain at the moment. How that will work out is anybody's guess at this stage. Ireland has been a very strong supporter of Ukraine in the war of aggression. I've been there. I was there actually shortly before the invasion took place, and all of this talk that the invasion was provoked and so on is utter nonsense. I was over on the contact line just outside Donetsk. I was in places like Kramatorsk and Avdiivka, very short time, a few weeks before that invasion took place. And the idea that, the Russian propaganda that somehow Ukraine was going to do some kind of an attack on Russia was just not the case. Similarly, I was there after, again, a short period of time after the invasion took place. I was in Kiev. I was in places like Bucha. I stood on the gravesite of the mass grave where the Russians tried to conceal the fact that they had killed so many people in their attempt to overtake Kiev. And Ireland has stood solidly with Ukraine. It's contributed it's made its contribution to the European Peace Facility in line with other countries, not for lethal equipment because of our traditional policy of military neutrality. And Ireland has welcomed a very large number of Ukrainian refugees. And I think if you look at it on a per head of population basis, it's one of the highest of any of the member states in Europe, with the exception of the countries immediately bordering Ukraine and close to it.
So do you think Ireland will support joint purchases of defense equipment or other joint EU funding for defense?
I think that is. I think that is a possibility. I think that we're looking at a situation now, I think, where the reality would appear to be that the United States is withdrawing from Europe, and certainly. So therefore, I think yes. I think Europe has to look at its own defence. I saw that the Taoiseach announced the last couple of days that Ireland would be willing to consider sending troops to peacekeeping mission to Ukraine in the event of whenever the war ends. I think there are issues given that Ireland is not in NATO, and given that it has a constitutional position. It would require a constitutional referendum for Ireland to participate in a formal European defence architecture. I think that there are areas of defence I think that Ireland needs to look at. I think in particular it needs to look at its maritime defence, the maritime area. Ireland has a maritime area which is 10 times its land area. And the country does need to build up its navy and its air corps to provide adequate surveillance and protection for that maritime area. And of course, under the sea, there are all of the cablings from North America, and that is something I think that we have to work with European partners to ensure that they are protected and that they're not damaged and that they are defended. So there are issues I think that Ireland has to address in the defence area. But ultimately, any major change, like for example membership of NATO, like formal membership of a European Defence Union, that would require a referendum, and it is my opinion that referendum in the present environment would not succeed.
Well, this is the thing. Like you say that Ireland isn't skeptical, but also the 2001 referendum did fail. They had to come back another time in 2002. Patrick, how does this look economically?
You pinpointed a number of points: military stuff, tax stuff. Some of Ireland's position on these things dates long before there was any question of a European community or a European Union. So that the hostility to being in NATO has roots back in, well, of course, before the island is united, we couldn't align ourselves with a military association that Britain was involved in. I'm talking about thinking of the 1940s and 1950s. And that became rooted into, we couldn't be part of NATO. And it takes a long time to shift those fundamental opinions. People, you may say, well, you're not participating in Europe, but the view in Ireland would be, oh, I didn't think that was part of Europe at all. We've had this policy long before Europe. And I think the same is to some extent true of the tax story. And it's not just tax, it's about corporation tax. It's because the whole of this attracting foreign multinationals became built on the tax, the corporate tax, the whole design of corporation tax, long before there was any thought of harmonizing direct taxes in Europe, and indeed they're still very far away. So people are saying, oh, well, it's not about Europe. It's just that we've had this tax system. Now, having said that, I think the contribution that Ireland has made in non-lethal ways in the Ukraine things tells you something a lot about Ireland's overall attitude to military threats. It hasn't yet become concrete in military assistance, but the attitude is there. The attitude is there, but not the practicalities. The same in taxation. After a long period of dragging our feet, the government has signed up to the international OECD-led agreements on corporation tax, something that now the United States is residing from. So I think that's the way to think about it, that Ireland is reluctant to actually change things that pre-existed Europe, and they haven't thought of it in European terms. Now, I think that Ireland probably will need to do a lot more in that direction before, if it is not to be seen as being too slow to respond to the new threats from Russia, the new threats from the position of the United States. But let's not forget that when you survey Irish respondents, Ireland is always on the trusts the European Union higher than the average, trusts various institutions in the Europe higher than average. So the attitude is pro-Europe, but the sense, and if you look at just think of the map of Europe. We're so far away from the front line. It's hard to get people to concentrate on risk from Russia is a risk to Ireland because we're part of Europe. And the same with the relation with the United States. We have been always so economically related to the United States over the past half century that it's very hard for people to think, does this have to change in some way? Does the taxation regime have to change in some way? The pressure in that case will come from the West, as it seems.
Walk us through the relationship with the UK. On the one hand, there seems to be a lasting peace agreement that has survived Brexit. Also, you mentioned that the Irish economy is not as dependent on the UK as it used to be. How has that evolved?
In business circles, the relation with the UK is not as strong as it was, but it is still very strong. And that can be neglected by commentators. A lot of the old industry and the services industry, they do business in London. Some of our, not most of them, but some of the leading retail stores are subsidiaries of British stores. The travel links have been to some extent by Brexit, but they're still important. There's a tendency to underestimate the importance of Britain, partly because the exports of the pharmaceuticals, the exports of the IT services are so large, even though they're not based on a very substantial value added in Ireland, but the gross numbers are very large, so that the exports to Britain tend to be a little bit neglected. Political relationships have waxed and waned over the past few years. Eamon can talk about that. But the economic relationships have, if they're being dismantled, they're still being dismantled rather more slowly than a lot of people expected after Brexit. And of course, the British economy has not done as badly after Brexit as a lot of people expected it. And so the knock-on to Ireland has been less severe than a lot of people expected it would be. Gradually, of course, it is going to be a British decline, and the links with Britain will attenuate, but it's a slow process.
I think the most significant thing in the relationship between Ireland and Britain is the success of the peace process in Northern Ireland. I was looking at the Global Peace Index recently, and it says that Ireland is now the second most peaceful country in the world. And that would have been unthinkable 30, 40 years ago when we were still had the conflict going on. I had the privilege of being Minister for Foreign Affairs, probably at the time when relations between Ireland and Britain were at their best, when Queen Elizabeth came to Ireland for the first time, President Higgins did a return state visit. And they weren't just big ceremonial occasions. They were also occasions to look at the trading relationship between the United Kingdom and Ireland. One of the things, for example, that we did at that time was the establishment, for the first time ever, and it surprised me, of a British-Irish Chamber of Commerce, a body that would work at a practical level on the trading relationship and the economic relationship between the two islands. I think notwithstanding Brexit, I think that trading relationship remains and has huge potential in retail, in many ways. Ireland is part of the UK's home market, and the UK is really part of Ireland's home market. We have the common travel area. There are very deep personal and family links between people in Ireland and the UK, and I think that will continue. I think the election of the Labour government in the UK under Keir Starmer, I think, will ensure that the relationship between the UK and the European Union will be a more sensible relationship than we had seen under a succession of his predecessors. But there's no doubt that Brexit has done damage economically and I think also politically. But I think that both countries can work to restore that, and I think also the European Union's own relationship with the United Kingdom will be better. But the economic, you trade with your nearest partner, your nearest neighbours, and there's a huge amount of trade between Ireland and the UK, and a huge amount of interpersonal exchanges and families and so on. And I think that is going to continue. And I think also that given that the issue of Irish unification is back on the agenda, at the end of the day, that can only be achieved by persuasion, not by pressure. And that means, I think, working on that British-Irish relationship and also working to ensure that the people who live on the island of Ireland and who consider themselves to be British feel at home on the island of Ireland and in a different, if there were to be unification, people have to feel at home in that and part of it and be respected. This cannot be an exercise in some kind of reverse triumphalism.
Patrick, do you think we'll see unification in the next decade or two?
Oh, I'm an expert on that, of course. I often said it might possibly happen in my lifetime, but I'm not sure how long I have left at this stage. I think that one has to imagine what that would look like, both internally, as Eamon hints at, it has to be a structure in which people feel comfortable in, and also what the rest of Europe will look like in a rapidly changing environment. What will a united Ireland look like? What would it be a part of in a wider Europe that may be changing over the next number of decades? I think, well, whatever Europe looks like, I think Ireland will, as it has shown, continue to be a significant contributor. I was just thinking, going back 15 years to the crisis, and in the financial arena, Ireland being so much in the doghouse, and now look at the several of the most prominent positions in the European institutions, financial institutions, the Director General of the FISMA in the European Commission, the chief economist of the European Central Bank, a long list of people I could give you, Irish significant contributors to the European project merely in finance, when 15 years ago we would have been considered as not bankable.
We're coming to the end of our time, which is unfortunate because I could talk to you guys all day about this stuff. But do you each have a hope and a concern about what could be coming up next?
I'll leave the last word to Eamon. My concern is that Europe will not be able to achieve what it needs to achieve with the institutional structures. There's not a sufficient pulling together. As Mario Draghi has recently said, we need to behave more as if we were one country. We're not one country, but as if we were one country. And I'm not sure that we are moving in that direction. We're not establishing the institutional arrangements that can achieve that fast enough to face, as Europe face the challenges that are rapidly changing.
Let me answer it at two levels. First of all, I think at Ireland's level, I think we have to ensure that we don't become complacent. You're in a situation that you have an economy that's doing very well, effectively full employment, very strong on foreign direct investment. You have to behave as if you don't have those things and to keep working at them and ensure that the economy remains strong, but also that the benefits of a strong economy reach people on the ground. And that means addressing the housing problem. It means addressing issues like low wages, where that is a reality. It means addressing the issues relating to uncertainty about employment and about future, particularly among young people. And I think that's also a feature of what needs to be done in Europe. These issues, I think what used to be called social Europe, the question of, will I get a job? Is the job going to be secure? Is it going to pay well enough for me to raise a family and so on? All of these issues I think we're losing sight of, and I think we need to return to them. I think we also have to plan in Europe, I think, on the basis that, I hope that the relationship with the United States is not being irreparably sundered. But I think we have to hope for the best, but I think we have to also plan for the worst case scenario. And that means looking at how the European Union can progress without a transatlantic relationship, or at least with a very weak transatlantic relationship, and possibly even one that may at times be not to advantage. And that means looking, I think, the Draghi report is there. It's set out what needs to be done in terms of the European economy. That has to be, I think, addressed. And I think the institutional issues that Patrick referred to, I think, yes, if we're talking about the enlargement of the European Union from 27 now to well over 30 member states eventually, well, then the way of doing business and the way of making decisions, that also has to be part of that conversation. We were talking earlier in a different context about the advantages of having 6 people around a table and what you can agree and get done as against having 20. Well, when you have 30 plus around the table, and on some issues, every one of them having a veto, it's not the best way to do business. So we have to think about how a larger European Union, and a European Union with a larger amount of competences than it has at the moment, how it's going to be able to effectively do business in a world which is completely changed. What we're seeing at the moment, this, if you like, coinciding of big tech interests and big technological revolution with the massive political changes that we're seeing on the other side of the Atlantic, and a different approach to doing business. We have to plan for that being the new reality, not just a blip for a couple of months at the beginning of one term of office. We have to think in terms of, this could go on for 12 years. And or maybe more, and we have to plan on that basis.
Thank you for that assessment. Thank you both for coming on. Certainly on the social question, Patrick, your book, Europe and the Transformation of the Irish Economy from 2023, talked about the social changes that put Ireland in position to build up its economy and develop these skills. Listeners, you can go find that book. You can see all of Bruegel's reports on these issues on the Draghi Report on our website, bruegel.org. You can find this podcast on all your favorite podcast channels. We thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to our guests, and we'll see you next time.